Deepesh Chakrabarti. I'm a professor in the departments of history and South Asian languages and civilizations. I just want to say a few words of thank you before I ask my valued colleague Jennifer Pitts in political science to introduce Professor Christopher Bailey, the speaker for this evening. So this event and a symposium we are having tomorrow in Foster 103, where Professor Bailey and Dr. Faisal Devji from Oxford will be talking to us on new directions in South Asian intellectual history. These two events have been supported by several groups and institutions within the university. I just want to thank them all. The Nicholson Center, the Committee for Southern Asian Studies, the Department of History at the university, and the International House Global Voices program. There is from Braden Cormack, who is the director of the Nicholson Center for British Studies, there's a very short message that he said he requests me to read out to say that on behalf of the Nicholson Center that this lecture is an unusually important moment in a now decade-long collaboration between the center and the different groups that make South Asian studies so strong at Chicago. And the Nicholson Center is very pleased, he says, to support the event, but also extremely grateful to these constituencies for their engagement with the center's mission to nurture a robust global British studies. And I have a few individuals to thank sincerely for all the work they have done to make these two events possible. And that's Irving Berkner, Neha Mohan, Toby Tiger, Esther Mansdorf, Alicia Seplowski, Elisa Padilla, and Jean Fitzsimmons. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jennifer Pitts, who is a professor in the political science department, to introduce Professor Bailey.
Thanks. It's my very great pleasure and honor to introduce Christopher Bailey, indeed Sir Christopher Bailey since 2007, Professor of History at Cambridge University, Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Historical Society, and recipient of the Wolfson Prize in History for Lifetime Achievement. Professor Bailey is the author of a shelf full of agenda-setting books in South Asian history, British imperial history, and world history. In a series of works in the 1980s and 1990s, including Imperial Meridian and Indian Society and the Making of the British Empire, he explored the complex interactions between local and imperial actors that led to the expansion and entrenchment of the British Empire. These books are distinguished by his remarkable ability to bring together political, social, economic, and intellectual history of India and the British alike. Likewise, in Empire and Information, Professor Bailey's deep research and historical imagination together enable him to take stock in a nuanced way of what he calls the engagement between the Anglo-Indian public and the Indian ecumeny. One recent reviewer noted that the continued popularity of Professor Bailey's works in Indian university curricula speaks to the relevance these have for understanding the genealogy of the post-colonial present. In the last decade, he's been pioneering approaches to world history, working on a global scale in the same comparative and connective vein that distinguishes his works in Indian and imperial history. His Birth of the Modern World, published in 2004, manages what most are able to do only in edited volumes with multiple collaborators, in offering an account of global developments that is at once highly textured and also synthetic. He's also fostered precisely the sort of global collaborative work that is also indispensable to the textured history he practices in special issues of modern intellectual history, on the Bhagavad Gita in the world, and on the advent of constitutional liberalism in India, as well as in edited books like the recent History, Historians, and Development Policy, A Necessary Dialogue. He's the author most recently of Recovering Liberties, Indian Thought in the Age of Liberalism and Empire, a signal contribution to the emerging field of global intellectual history. With each project, Professor Bailey opens new vistas and fascinating new conversations, so it's with a sense of real anticipation that I've awaited his lecture this afternoon, as I'm sure all of you have as well. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pitts, and thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for your very kind welcome. And I think everybody has been most welcoming here in the last couple of days, and I'm enjoying myself tremendously, meeting new people. Is the microphone okay, or is it too close? Okay? Well, in the past years, many of us have given fairly general lectures about the way historians have countered Eurocentrism, by which we mean the reading of all history out of European history, and a resolute emphasis on how Europe influenced the world, ignoring the opposite influences. Today I want to be more precise, more focused, by discussing these issues through the work of one particular historian, Marshall G.S. Hodgson, who wrote about world history from the perspective of Islam. I'll also deal with other and more recent challenges to Eurocentrism. In these days of the Syrian insurrection, the Arab Spring, the issue of Palestine, and the phenomenal wealth of the Gulf states, this focus on Hodgson doesn't seem inappropriate. So what I shall be offering is a historiography of challenges to Eurocentric history, ending with some reflections on the present situation. Now, many of you in this room, I'm sure, will know considerably more about Hodgson than I do, because this is his own university, of course. But I hope to put his work in a rather different context. Marshall G.S. Hodgson, who died in 1968, was one of the founding figures of the writing of modern world history and a critical influence on the development of the Western understanding of Islam. He was what might be called a counter-Orientalist, because he used the tools of Oriental scholarship to create a new and more favorable understanding of the Muslim world. Unlike his now more celebrated successor, Edward Said, he worked directly on the cultural heritage of Islam, while Said could broadly be said to be an intellectual historian of Europe. Yet Edmund Burke III, Terry Burke, one of Hodgson's greatest admirers and the editor of his posthumous collection of essays, Rethinking World History, writes of the venture of Islam, Hodgson's major work, that in some respects it was a splendid anachronism, an idealist approach to the subject which also had to be understood at least equally through a consideration of demographic, economic, and social change. So the first section of this talk attempts to resolve the paradox by setting Hodgson's thought in the context of world and American historiography during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It goes on to assess the strengths and weaknesses of Hodgson's approach in terms of more recent scholarship. I end by considering how recent challenges to Eurocentric history have evolved from and also differed from Hodgson's work. Now, placing Hodgson in or ahead of his times. Marshall Hodgson's work can be understood at two interlinked levels. On one level, he emerged out of a very specific historical and anthropological tradition which had developed at this university in the 1940s and 50s. This tradition, overseen by the Committee on Social Thought, looked for intellectual inspiration to the great books of continental Europe, especially Germany, because Chicago remained in quite a significant part a German-speaking city. The tradition was broadly dismissive of what was seen as Anglo-Saxon empiricism. It promoted an understanding of culture, or Kultur, which derived from the anthropology of Franz Boas, amongst others. This was a relativistic form of thought, which rejected the historicism and progressivism seen, for instance, in Spencer, Mill, and the neo-Darwinists. The desire to understand world cultures in their own terms was later developed in the work of some of Hodgson's anthropological contemporaries and younger colleagues, notably Milton Singer on India, Robert Redfield on Latin America, Clifford Geertz on Indonesia, and in his later work at least, Bernard S. Cohn, a friend of mine in my early days, on India and the British. Hodgson's intellectual sensibility was also influenced, as Burke argues, by his personal Quaker beliefs and, I quote, cranky obsessions, which include vegetarianism, a concern with terminology, and one could add a vaunting geographical vision. Hodgson was also a fitness fanatic who died very young, as many of you know, because he insisted on running marathons in the summer heat of this city. At a wider level, these Chicago intellectuals drew on and transformed into a particularly American form of thought the works of a number of continental European writers on Islam and world history. While Hegel, for instance, had held that India was an immature civilization distorted by dreamy Hindu aesthetics, he had viewed early Islamic monotheism much more favorably as one stage in the march of the spirit of freedom, Only later did Islam, according to Hegel, retreat into Oriental ease and repose, with the result that the single truly free person in Muslim societies was the king. Arguably, one can see a trace of this version of understanding of Islam as the embodiment of the spirit of freedom in Hodgson's own work. Hodgson, however, insisted that Islam's retreat did not truly occur until the 18th century. By 1914, other positive and comparative views of Islam in Asia had come to the fore, especially in continental European scholarship. These range from Nietzsche's characterization of the prophet as hero, anticipated by Thomas Carlyle, to Max Weber's understanding of the relationship between religion and rationalization in world context. As Burke again notes, Louis Massignon, the French Arabist, and the Austrian-American Islamist Gustav von Grunebaum were particularly influential on the development of Hodgson's thought. What were the resonances of these thinkers for him? Louis Massignon can be understood in the context of French colonialism in Algeria. Experience of travel and colonial service was always critical in widening the views of European scholars. Massignon had relations amongst colonial officials in Algeria, which he visited in 1901-2. Following his graduation from the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris, later during a visit to Mesopotamia in 1907, he emerged from a very dangerous situation in Baghdad as a reconvert to Catholic Christianity, but still influenced by Islamic humanism. His understanding of both Christianity and Islam was deeply mystical. Belief followed from the visitation of a stranger, meaning God, to the individual spirit. As a Christian mystic in a Muslim context, he was also influenced by the French-Algerian hermit Charles de Foucauld, who had become a kind of St. Francis to the Tuareg tribes of North Africa. Massignon's La Passion d'Al-Harraj, dealing with the great 11th century mystical scholar, brought these two religious strains together. Massignon's fixation with mysticism was later criticized by Edward Said, while generally exonerating from the Saidian vision of Orientalism. But he believed that Massignon had marginalized the legalistic and social dimension of Islam. Yet this obsession was what gave Massignon a unique empathy with Muslims across the world. Apart from Massignon's scholarly range and imagination, his attraction for Hodgson lay in his Christian religious commitment and his deep love of Sufi mystical traditions within Islam. It's true, of course, that Hodgson himself was aware of and ambivalent about the intellectual dangers of reading Islam out of Christianity or vice versa. Yet his own Quaker Christianity made him favorable to what he saw as the socially equalizing aspects and emphasis on personal conscience in both original Christianity, reflected of course in Quakerism, and also the moral equality preached by the Prophet Muhammad. Still, the compassion of the Sufi provided a key entree for Hodgson into the world of universalistic humanism which he imagined. A second feature linking Massignon and Hodgson was their determination to include Persian thought and literature in the studies of the Islamic world. Mansur al-Hallaj himself was born in the province of Fars in Persia, and his family had originally been Zoroastrian. Yet it's important to be aware of the differences between the sensibility of Hodgson and Massignon. Hodgson had flourished in a university which was acutely conscious of the rising power of the United States in the world, and a teaching tradition designed to equip the citizens of the new superpower with regional knowledge and sympathy for oppressed peoples. Hodgson was also aware, in his later years at least, of the force of Islamic revival, which was reflected in the rise of the economic power of the oil-rich Arab states, the foundation of Pakistan, the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the like. The last chapters of his third volume, of The Venture of Islam, record his ambivalence about and admiration for these new forces. By contrast, Massignon, who was considerably older than Hodgson and even more devoted to mysticism than he was, struck a note of nostalgia and regret for the decline of classical Islam in his works. History for Massignon was an essential component of the art of compassion. The collection L'Islam et l'Occident, 1947, which he edited with Sheikh El-Razak of the Al-Azhar Muslim University of Cairo and others, begins with an essay by Jean Ballard, which deplored the decline of both Islam and the West, the latter corrupted by fascism, communism, and genocidal war. Massillon himself, writing after a visit to Herat in Afghanistan, pictured Islam crushed between a declining British Empire to the south and aggressive communist powers to the north. Worse still was le choc moral des techniques européennes, and I think this is an interesting forerunner of Hodgson's dismissive idea of Western technicalism, meaning an overemphasis on material development at the expense of spirit. Massillon awaited le Renaissance, le classicisme arabe nouveau qui mettra l'islam de le niveau avec les cimes de la culture mondiale, putting Islam at the top of the culture of world societies. But this was still wanting in the 1940s, just as Catholic Christianity was embattled in his native France. Despite this subtle difference in sensibilities, however, there's no doubting the influence of Massillon and his French co-workers on Hodgson. For instance, the essay by Émile Dermengen in l'Islam et l'Occident, Témoignage d'Islam, marks out Islam as a nation intermédiaire, an intermediate place, an intermediate nation, helping to link Europe, East Asia, and Black Africa. This is also, in my mind, a clear precursor to Hodgson's idea of an Afro-Eurasian oikumene, an assault on the geographical version of Eurocentrism. The stance of a second figure, Gustav von Grunebaum, a direct colleague of Hodgson as professor of Arabic in Chicago, and I've not been able to find a photograph of him for some reason, was attractive to Hodgson for similar reasons. A refugee from the cosmopolitan world of late Austro-Hungarian Empire, von Grunebaum left Europe as it was engulfed by the Nazis. He was convinced of an intellectual obligation resting on Western students of Islam, these are his words, to interpret it humanely to his own society, particularly for its moral worth. This was a position with which Hodgson was very much in favor, though von Grunebaum's passion was to explain this worth through a detailed textual study of Arabic poetry. His medieval Islam achieved a similar synthetic scope to Hodgson's thought for a more limited time period, as it attempted to reveal the universal humanity of Islamic civilization through Arabic literature. Von Grunebaum and the South Asian scholar Aziz Ahmed worked together on the Muslims of India and Pakistan during Hodgson's final years. It seems likely that this shift to the east provides one context for Hodgson's own engagement with South Asian historiography, which came quite late in his life and informs the final chapters of Volume 3 of the venture. Few British scholars of Islam, or for that matter, Ivy League American scholars, appear either as colleagues of Hodgson or in his footnotes. One of the few was Hamilton Gibb, another student of Arabic literature and society, who wrote Mohammedanism, a historical survey, in 1949. Hodgson would have approved Gibb's point of religious departure as a Scottish Protestant who admired the democratic spirit of Islam, but he would have objected to other aspects of his writing. Gibb wrote in a social Darwinist tradition that saw civilizations rise and fall like living organisms. He asserted the superiority of Christianity to Islam in a way that Hodgson never did. Unlike Massillon and Hodgson, Gibb tended to marginalize Sufism, Shi'ism, and even Arab scientific rationality. Finally, Gibb and his co-worker Bowen believed that many of the most creative features of early modern Islam were consequences of the influence of converted Muslim servants, Christian servants of the Ottoman regime, who had originated in Christian Eastern Europe. This reflected a subtle version of that Eurocentrism, which was Hodgson's main target throughout his life. So, Hodgson's context in transnational historiography. Reading Hodgson's collected essays, one might get the impression that he was one of the few voices crying out in the wilderness against the disparagement of Islam and Eurocentric versions of world history. In fact, the situation was much more complex. From the middle of the 19th century, there were many historians and social commentators who took issue with the organicism and progressive historicism which saw Europe emerging from classical antiquity through the Renaissance to stand at the pinnacle of human achievement. This historiography, as in Hodgson's case, was often tinged with religious sentiment. In particular, many such writers, not only on Islam, but also on India and China, displayed what I've elsewhere called a redemptive turn of mind. That's to say, they believed that Asia's and Africa's contemporary humiliations could be redeemed by finding and emphasizing those aspects of its religion and culture which had once put them at the pole of human achievement. Yet it wasn't only Asians who needed to be redeemed, for Western imperialism had wrought disaster across the world and could only be atoned for by humility, scholarship, and education. True, the dominant liberal imperialists of the late Victorian period despised Islamic society and the Ottoman Empire in particular, or argued that their social and political structures were primitive. This theme was particularly blatant in the writings of Henry Maine, James Bryce, and William Gladstone himself. Hodgson later dismissed Arnold Toynbee, not only because of his organicism and the alleged naivety of his understanding of the nature of civilizations, but also because he fell squarely into the Bryce tradition of writing off Islam as tyrannical and Ottoman government as a mere assemblage of tribute takers. But even in Britain, there was another radical liberal school which viewed Islam and Asian societies in a more positive light. Thomas W. Arnold, for instance, deprecated the views of William Muir and other Indian colonial officials who derided Islam as a religion of blood and conquest, cemented by, I quote, the love of rapine and the lust of spoil. Arnold, who'd taught at the modernist Anglo-Mohammedan college at Aligarh in North India, stressed the peaceful expansion of the faith and its appeal to slaves and the underprivileged. He protested against the prejudice and unfairness of ignoring the missionary work of Islam, anticipating Hodgson. Like Hodgson, he was attracted to the Hermetic religious life, translating the Little Flowers of St. Francis. Again, like the later Chicago school, he was aware of the work done by French, German, and Dutch scholars, pointing in particular to the work of the Paris journal Revue du Monde Musulman, which took an enlightened view of the political stirrings in the Muslim world after 1900, such as the Persian Revolution of 1909. Another British scholar, E.G. Brown, took a similar benign view of Iran's emergence from monarchical despotism, again drawing on contemporary French work. Later in the 1930s, Joseph Needham, a pupil of Brown, Anglican Christian and historian of science, wrote of the origin of Western knowledge in China, and envisions history as a story of the survival not of the fittest, but of the most altruistic. Hodgson himself sought to reorientate world history away from its Western axis by treating Europe as a cape or promontory on the margins of an Afro-Eurasian oikoumene. Yet this effort had begun nearly a century earlier, before, in India, a country which is more often alluded to in passing rather than discussed in Hodgson's early essays on global history. In the 1820s, Ram Mohan Roy and Ram Ras had both critiqued the European view that representative government had only emerged in Greece, citing the ancient Indian deliberative body, the Panchayat. Ram Ras also refuted the view that Indian architecture was derived from Greek and Egyptian models. 50 years later, K.T. Telang demolished the notion that the great Hindu epic, the Ramayana, was derivative of the Greek myths. By 1900, Aurobindo Ghosh and the young Mahatma Gandhi were asserting that European civilization was morally inferior to those of Asia, which excelled only in what Hodgson later called technicalism. Okakura, his Ideals of the East, 1904, Japanese scholar, sparked off a whole series of works on the superiority of Asian culture and art. Notable here was Ananda Kentish Coomaraswamy, the Anglo-Ceylonese art historian who worked in Princeton University for much of Hodgson's life. It's in fact rather puzzling that, at least in his world history essays, Hodgson paid so little attention to non-European writers who, by the 1930s and 40s, had flooded English and French literature with books and articles attempting to rectify the Eurocentric bias he so deplored. His focus, of course, continued to be on Islamic society in his general essays, but even in West Africa and North Africa, a figure such as Salama Musa, the Coptic essayist and violent critic of British dominion in his country, was an anti-Orientalist who anticipated Edward Said in many respects, both in rhetoric and in argument. In West Africa, Dr. J.B. Danker attacked the distorting effects of the modern West, which had betrayed its original Christian ideals. Many of these authors, both Europeans and Asians, could be seen as religious reformers and even mystics in their different traditions. Not all of them were in any sense modernizers. Indeed, many of them deeply deplored technicalization, falling back on ideas of the simple morality of the East, as in the case of Gandhi or Kakuza. Others, such as T. Lawrence or Massillon de Foucault, were entranced not by the modernism of the Tanzimat, the Ottoman and later Turkish reformers, but by the simple life of the Bedou, and gloried in young Arab male manhood. A particular upfront version of this homoerotic religiosity, in the Indian case, was Edward Carpenter, a gay radical who supported Indian nationalism and believed that the lingams, the stylized representations of male sexual organs found in some Hindu temples, were a premonition of worldwide sexual liberation. Setting Hodgson's work in its period, one of continuing Western dominance and late idealist thought, makes it clear why the discussion of his work dwindled in quantity and quality within a few years of his death. The profession turned sharply away from the idealism of Massillon. Even Hodgson's more restrained call to write public history seemed at odds with the academic hyper-professionalism of the time. In English language historiography, Herbert Butterfield was perhaps the last major writer to make his Christian religious confession so clear in his work. Albert Hourani wrote luminously about Arabic thought, but the tone of Islamic historiography in Britain, at least, was captured by the two-volume Cambridge History of Islam, 1971, a compilation of detailed narratives largely lacking in reflection and argument. The decline of idealism was, however, combined with what Hodgson might well have considered a form of historians' technicalism. Even the disagreements with William McNeill on the timing of the Western breakout from the Ecumene seemed marginal compared with a turn towards the history of demography, capitalism, and economic change, which overtook the field of world history after 1970. The background of this shift can be found in two bodies of writing. First, there was the rearmament of Marxism in continental Europe and Britain, signaled by the appearance of writing by the late Eric Hobsbawm, André Gunder Frank, Perry Anderson, and more recently Hart and Negri. All these reflected a sophisticated superstructural interpretation of world history, yet paid considerably more attention to factors and modes of production than Hodgson had ever done. Parallel with this work was a range of publications which could be classified as non-Marxist materialist in character. Here, the looming figure was, of course, Fernand Brodel, who finally dispelled the French version of idealist historiography represented by Massillon and propelled the Annales school to the center of historical scholarship. Brodel's views of Islam emerged most clearly in his later volume, The History of Civilizations. In French, the original title was Grammaire des Civilisations, which is revealing, I think. Brodel expressed himself uninterested in the event and only partially interested in conjuncture. His structuralist interpretation ascended from geography through sociology and economics to social psychology, the nearest thing to intellectual culture in his canon, though itself a weak form of knowledge. Islam, in his view, lagged 2 centuries behind the West, even in the 16th century. Its towns had arisen early, but it had failed to conquer the countryside, as Europe had done. Further, in a latter-day recapitulation of Hegel, Islam failed to keep pace with Europe because it had not managed to privilege reason over religion, according to him. Apparently, religion was the problem for all non-European civilizations, bar a few 12th century Arab philosophers and Chinese sophists. Brodel's so-called total history remained profoundly Eurocentric. This utterly conventional interpretation, or perhaps a premonition in some respects of Samuel Huntington's ideas of clash of cultures, fails to acknowledge the long struggles by Arabic philosophers through to Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida in the 19th century to adjust reason to Sharia, God's law, nor the fact that they'd quite often been more successful in that venture than their Christian contemporaries. Even from a materialist viewpoint, Europe's conquest of the Americas and its propensity for internal warfare seemed to present a better interpretation for Europe's divergency and its 2 centuries predominance, now ending, of course, than that old dichotomy. Here, Hodgson's work, which emphasized the event, in this case Muhammad's teaching, belief, ideology, and equality, retains its value. Obviously, neither Brodel's structuralism nor Hodgson's idealism can give a complete interpretation of the decline and resurgence of Islam today. But Hodgson's value is clear in an era when easy historiographical materialism and Eurocentrism remain pervasive, if increasingly dented by the rise of the BRICS and the kivets. A direct intellectual descendant of Brodel was K.N. Chaudhry, another friend of mine, who wrote on world history and the history of Islamicate world, as he didn't call it, from the bottom up, but avoided Eurocentrism. It's striking that in Chaudhry's most general work, Asia Before Europe, 1990, and one which dwells on temporality and the geography of a large part of Afro-Eurasia, Hodgson doesn't merit a single footnote mention in the text or bibliography. This is in sharp contrast to Chaudhry's near deification of Brodel and the excursions into set theory and linguistic philosophy which he made. Hodgson is also absent in Chris Wickham's study, Framing the Early Middle Ages, which brings together the Islamic and Christian Mediterranean worlds, as Hodgson had done in Volume 2 of the venture, though concentrating on aristocracies, peasantries, rural settlements, and exchange. The works published or edited by A.G. Hopkins on the history of globalization once again generally neglect Hodgson. Hopkins and his contributors emphasize trade and exchange, and insofar as they consider Islamdom, it's almost exclusively as an economic area. Recently, several younger historians have turned to the issue which Hodgson debated with McNeill, the tipping point when Europe achieved its economic and political advantage over the rest of the world. Kenneth Pomerantz wrote of the great divergence between Europe and China, dating it very late, towards the end of the 18th century, when Britain finally achieved maritime dominance and the beginnings of industrialization. R. Bin Wang wrote China Transformed, the Limits of European Experience. His new book, Before and Beyond Divergence, The Politics of Economic Change in China and Europe, published in 2011, co-authored with Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, extends the analysis of comparative European and Chinese political economy. The strength of this work is its very careful approach to comparative methodology. Rather than arguing that China and Europe took fundamentally different paths to modernity and industrialization, Bin Wang and Rosenthal illustrate a good deal of commonality between aspects of Chinese political economy and its European counterpart. In doing so, they emphasize comparisons of scale and the way in which relatively small differences, for instance in the form of property rights, had significant longer-term consequences through to the present. What's most impressive about this work is the fact that it refuses to make grandiose historical claims about Chinese exceptionalism or, conversely, simply absorb European into Chinese historical paradigms or vice versa. Finally, Prasannan Parthasarathy has brought India back into the debate about the expansion of Europe in his Why Europe Grew Rich and Asia Did Not. Here again, in these works, Hodgson's own legacy is missing, while what he called technicalism receives constant and consistent emphasis. So is Hodgson's writing an anachronism? I'm struck by the fact that while he rarely appears in footnotes, not until recently anyway, so many Asian and world historians I've spoken to in the last year or two continue to express admiration for him and urge their students to read him. So critiquing Hodgson, this section moves on to a closer examination of Hodgson's own arguments about modernity, Islam, and world history. 3 questions are central. When should we now date the, quotes, rise of the West, the issue mentioned above? What work does the concept of technicalism do for Hodgson and for us? Finally, is there any merit in Hodgson's idealist intellectual religious conception of the 3 centuries long decline of Islam and the non-European world? It's quite important to state here that critiquing Eurocentrism in history does not require us to underplay the profound significance of the centuries of European world domination. What we need to do is to put it into a global context. But how? Hodgson's vigorous disagreements with McNeill over the timing of the European breakout seem to reflect some of his key assumptions. In the first place, Hodgson emphasized the continuing spread of Islam as the predominant agrarianate civilization well into the 17th century, highlighting the Ottomans' advance into the Mediterranean and the Balkans, or the Mughals into Hindu India. McNeill had committed a disastrous error, according to Hodgson, in arguing for the great importance of the Portuguese voyages around through the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope, and emphasizing 1500 as the turning point in world history. These expeditions were merely, according to Hodgson, one more venture with an essentially agrarianate-level historical complex. In addition, the Renaissance, constantly lauded by European scholars, could not easily be linked to the technicalistic advance of Western nations, which was only really a feature of the later 17th century and beyond. So the classic teleology of European expansion, linking the fall of Constantinople, the diffusion of Greek knowledge, the Renaissance, and the voyages of discovery, displayed a systematic Western bias. Hodgson was probably right that the consequences of Vasco da Gama's circumnavigation of Africa took decades to reveal themselves, and that during the 16th century, the Portuguese remained little more than the Kafirs of Asia, in Sanjay Subramanian's words. The broader importance of the westward expansion of the Iberian regimes, signalled by the voyages of Columbus and his successors, shouldn't be underestimated, however. The massive die-off of the Amerindian peoples was well entrained by the middle of the 16th century, and this distorted global demography for 300 years. The discovery and exploitation of the silver of Mexico and Peru fundamentally changed the balance of global commercial power. Indeed, historians of the Ottoman world have shown how the empire, and by extension the other Islamicate gunpowder empires, quite rapidly suffered inflation as a consequence of the silver flow, but failed to benefit as much as Western Europeans did from the broader expansion of world trade. The more recent Asia-centric debate about the timing of Europe's rise, which Hodgson anticipated, has also relatively downplayed these Atlantic conquests, the rise of plantation slavery, and the techniques of governance and exploitation which Europeans developed in the New World. Pomerantz, for instance, certainly acknowledges the importance of the Americas as a huge storeroom of resources which Europeans could plunder. But Jesuit and Dominican ethnology, the surprisingly early development of closely governed imperial provinces in the Spanish New World, and above all the violent expansion of amphibious warfare between medium-sized European powers to the rest of the world, surely constituted an epochal change which was well entrained by 1600. In this sense, McNeill was right about the significance of the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, no longer a mere promontory or cape of Hodgson's Afro-Eurasian oecumene. Europe had discovered a vast new hinterland. Hodgson's discussion of what he calls the Great Transformation in the Venture Volume 3, the second key argument, is particularly general and lacking in temporal specificity, except when it comes to the generation of 1789. This is understandable in view of the fact that most of it was abstracted from his notes and drafts after his death. But we can still ask the question, what work does the concept of technicalization do for Hodgson, and how far can we use it? As Edmund Burke III notes, there's a tension between Hodgson's acknowledgement that this is a process which distinguished our world from its agrarian precursors, began in northwestern Europe, and his insistence that technicalization was a global change. To some degree, however, more recent scholarship may help to resolve this tension. Jan de Vries's argument that early modern Europe had already undergone industrious revolutions characterized by more direct and rationalized forms of labor control and production can be expanded to other parts of the world. Indian silk and cotton textile industries, or Chinese porcelain production, for instance, seem to have gone through periods of concentration with more direct use of capital and labor in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Much of this enhanced production was directed to the internal market, though the European joint stock companies were later beneficiaries. The notion of industrious revolutions also moves agency away from the supposed once-and-for-all breakthrough of British industrialization, an argument of which Hodgson was very suspicious. To this extent, Hodgson's emphasis on the global nature of technicalization was clever. At the time, though, he unduly downplays the significance of the new relationship evolving in Europe between the state, capital, and science in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Even before British industrialization, a phase of proto-industrialization and knowledge accumulation developing out of the earlier industrious revolutions had brought about a great leap forward in Northern Europe. New techniques of map-making, astronomy, and gunnery, arising out of the need to protect and exploit the Atlantic slave economies, were an important indicator of change. Capital formation had been rationalized, and new forms of risk avoidance and insurance had developed, as Adrian Leonard has recently argued, and these were considerably more sophisticated than anything found at this period in Asia or the Islamicate world. Hodgson made much of the distorting effect of Mercator's map projections, but if we compare Ottoman maps of the 17th and 18th century in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul with European maps, which ranged from Alaska to Japan, the considerable lag in scientific knowledge became clear. Of course, as Pierre Chaunou and most recently Joanna Whaley-Cohen and others have argued, China continued to expand on its inner frontiers, as did the Ottoman Empire on the eastern frontier. But it's become clear that these inner expansions were fragile, and the military forces that carried them out lacked the sort of complex logistical support which European armies and navies had developed by about 1700. Finally, and importantly, the ideology of northwestern European states presupposed a degree of control over the economy, labor, and even intellectual activity, not at this time matched in the rest of the Afro-Eurasian world. This had developed out of religiously motivated persecuting state into something resembling much more closely Michel Foucault's governmentality. By contrast, the great Asian and Middle Eastern states generally offlaid functions onto local linguistic and other ethnic elites, whether it was the Hindu agrarian or urban commercial societies in Mughal India, or the Han Chinese majority in Manchu China. When these states tried to impose economic, let alone doctrinal conformity, the result was rebellion and fragmentation, as Aurangzeb found in the Maratha lands and the Sikh Punjab, and the Qing state was to find in the later 18th century. Hodgson acknowledged these significant developments in European state and society from time to time. He even writes a few lines on the significance of British industrialization. Yet his interpretation is constrained by his desire to emphasize the continuing vitality of the Islamicate and Asian world to the end of the 17th century and even later. Equally, his predilection for ideal types and the unity of civilizational essences means that the history of events has very little purchase on his arguments until we reach 1789. Finally, his religious and moral understanding of history means that he is constantly forced to deny any overriding attribute of progress or rationality to the West's modernity. Technicalism, he argued, was often less rational in moral and civilizational terms than supposedly tradition-bound societies of the old agrarian world. Thus, spiritual techniques such as yoga or Sufism were ignored in the modern West. Now, it's obvious that Hodgson was profoundly irritated by the simplistic dichotomy between tradition and modernity that was characteristic of much 1960s anthropology. But his relativism and universalism could once again obscure significant historical developments. After all, psychiatry and psychoanalysis could be seen as technicalized versions of these earlier spiritual techniques. Freud had Hindu deities on his study desk. Jung attempted to bring Eastern learning into his humanistic vision. The early 20th century Indian intellectual Bhagavan Das, for example, was at once a late Hindu theosophist, what he called a spirituo-materialist socialist, and a Freudian. It seems to me, in fact, that there need to be no contradiction between an argument that takes as read European dynamism and one that continues to stress internal change and cultural development within the remainder of the oikoumene. It was the very capacity of Europe to take advantage of these extra-European developments in commerce, government, and intellect, which made possible the onset of imperialism. For instance, the joint stock companies could appropriate the value added by Asian and Middle Eastern artisan production because of their command of arms shipping. Over much of Asia, European commercial entrepreneurs were dependent until the mid-19th century on the capital of indigenous merchant groups. Emerging European territorial empires could also hire the sophisticated military forces of the late gunpowder empires and employ judges of the Sharia or of the Chinese gentry administration in their dash to gain land revenue and trade privileges. An approach that emphasized differential economic, political, and intellectual development rather than the late rise of the West would also have helped Hodgson nuance his gloomy picture of Asian and Muslim worlds in the 18th century, which he called perhaps the worst period in the whole history of Islam. Hodgson's gloom seems to arise not only from the onset of European territorial conquest in this period, but also from a sense that the universalism of Islamicate theology was giving way to a profound localization and ideological fragmentation. There's no doubt that the Ayans became increasingly independent of Ottoman power, or that the late Mughal provinces fragmented the Mughal state. Yet historians in the last generation have rejected the picture of wholesale political, economic, and intellectual decline during the 18th century. They've pointed, for instance, to the manner in which the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt laid some of the foundation for Mehmet Ali's later modernization of the country in the early 19th century. Recent work has also noted the vitality of Hadrami and Indo-Malayan Islam along the Straits of Malacca. In the Indian case, the new political and literary language, Urdu, flourished even before its poets bewailed the decline of Delhi and Agra. New centers of learning sprang up in Lucknow and Hyderabad, while the first stirrings of Muslim revival, bringing together Sufism and legalism, were evidenced in the career of Shah Waliullah of Delhi. The Deoband school, which arose from Waliullah's teaching later in the 19th century, soon developed strong connections with reformist elements in Arabia, the Hadramaut, and Ottoman Empire more generally. Hodgson may have disliked the intolerance of Arabian Wahhabism, distant precursor of the Taliban, but he certainly noted the power of the new revivalist movements as they broadened out to challenge Western modernity in its own terms. Again, even if the Qing Empire faced the first of a series of internal rebellions toward the end of the 18th century, many historians now laud Chen Qianlong's reign in the 18th century as one of the great periods of Chinese cultural efflorescence. Hodgson, of course, tended to overestimate the influence of Islam in India, Southeast Asia, and China. The leveling religious movements of Kabir, Chaitanya, and the Sikhs, for instance, drew on deep Hindu and Indic themes and were, in many respects, only superficially responses to Islam. He also underestimated the global significance of emerging Western liberalism and contractualism from Locke through Hume to the French and the Scottish Enlightenments. But his continuing emphasis on Sharia, in its broader sense, through the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, does raise an important issue in world history, the power of ideas in their own right. While Hodgson may have downplayed demography in economy and the role of state throughout the later parts of the venture, it could well be argued that more recent world historians have paid too little attention to the importance of intellectual history and political thought. Certainly, Hodgson's observation of the influence of the new ideologies in the 19th and 20th century worlds is particularly acute. His treatment of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, both in his Egyptian and his Persian context, for instance, reveals very much of his understanding of Sharia. In his interpretation, al-Afghani was able to radicalize Islamicate ideology in an effort to oppose the now oppressive power of the West in both Egypt and Iran. In emphasizing the rigid form of the law, opposing Sufism, and denouncing Western godlessness, Afghani consolidated group sentiment, but in moving away from individualistic Sharia-mindedness towards communal radicalism, he contributed to the relative inability of Iranians to, I quote, achieve satisfactory modernization. Here, Hodgson appears to have made use of the arguments in Albert Hourani's Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, 1962, by creatively inserting his own long-term arguments about the evolution of Islam. Hodgson's interpretation of the thought and influence of Gandhi and Iqbal is equally subtle and revelatory of his own history of conscience. Here he anticipated the recent turn towards intellectual history in South Asian studies. This type of argument insists on reinserting the history of ideas into a field long dominated by economists and instrumentalist interpretations of politics, but at the same time distances itself from a neo-Christian or Tolstoyan interpretation of Gandhi on the one hand, which overemphasizes the influence of European idealists on Iqbal on the other. In the latter case, Hodgson argues that while Iqbal deplored the tendency of Sufism to encourage political and religious quietism and argued for the self-making power of exceptional individuals, his own thought was preponderantly drawn from Sufi writers. Throughout his whole corpus of work, indeed, Hodgson sought to reconcile Sharia-mindedness with Sufi insight while insisting that the former should be guided by legalistic interpretation, but not confined within it. This raises the question of how far Hodgson's interpretation of Islam and world history could retain its force for the decades after his death in 1968. Now finally, challenges to Eurocentralism. Despite the internal conflicts within Hodgson's view of world history, current events have tended to confirm his claim that historical change for most of human history has to be understood as a pattern of connection across the whole Afro-Eurasian oikoumene, more recently impacted on by events in the Americas. Works such as Robert Duquesne's The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, published last year, continue to appear, but their tone is much more self-aware than Eurocentric and Westernist teleologies of the 1940s and 50s, which Hodgson deplored. In a minor way, the emergence of the Arabic television station Al Jazeera has decisively replaced Mercator's worldview. More soberingly, perhaps, China's recent offer to bail out Eurozone economies by buying infrastructure and its massive financial hold on the USA have evidently tipped the world away from the West. Meanwhile, Indian homegrown technicalism, if you like, has been on show in Bangalore, while Indian businessmen now figure among the 10 richest people in the world for the first time since about 1720. Truly, Europe has once again begun to retreat to its status as a cape or promontory of Afro-Eurasia, as it was for Marshall J.S. Hodgson when he wrote The Venture of Islam all those years ago. Thank you very much. But I'd also like comments, because as I say, this is his university.
Would you like to take your questions?
Pardon?
Would you like
Yes, I'll take the questions. Yeah.
Just to start off.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thinking of their questions. It was fascinating, wonderful